drones. And the next speaker I have is Brigadier General Derek JOYCE, and he'll be presenting on investments made by the Canadian government in drones, as well as the policy for such use of drones in Canada. General?
Thanks very much, Garrett. Boy, are we going to have a good question and answer period this afternoon. It's going to start off by the fact that you've got 3 presentations up here today, and neither one of us are going to use the same terminology. All right. We've heard about, airborne robotics. We've heard about drones. You're going to hear UAVs. I'm going to refer to the systems that we're going to be talking about today as unmanned aircraft systems, which is pretty much the Western military terminology for how we're approaching this kind of capability. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm really happy to be here and excited to be here to have the opportunity to talk about where D&D and where the Canadian Forces are going with UAS technology, what we've done, and talk a little bit about the policy as well. So this is what I'm going to talk about. Our investment in UASs. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges that we've experienced in the past and some of those in the future as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about policy, because policy is not mature at this point. It's developing, and we need to look at a number of considerations as we go forward. So our investment. Let me just explain this slide a little bit. As you see on the bottom, you've got a time chart which commences in October 2003 in Afghanistan, essentially. That's when we started using UASs to support Canadian Army operations in Afghanistan. And then you see a number of bars across. The green ones, it's quite a code. The green ones for Army operations. Okay, the light blue are for Air Force operations, and the dark blue are for Navy operations of UASs. So we started off with the spur work in October 2003. And it started off as an Army acquisition, and it was initially organized and controlled by the Army, and then fairly shortly after that, the Air Force took over. We had good success with the spur war for a number of different reasons. It was, and I say only good. It wasn't excellent. The situation, the environment in Afghanistan is very harsh. Down in Kandahar region, very high altitude. In the summertime, very hot. And the engineering of that spur war capability, that aircraft, was not suited for that kind of environment. As Ian mentioned, it was made for Europe. And so employing it in the kind of environment that we experienced in Afghanistan, we ran into some problems. And the reality was it was effective at what it did. But we ended up retiring it in February '09. The Army then brought on board the Skylark, which is a mini UAV, a miniature UAV. And that, again, had mixed success, primarily because of the challenges of operating this kind of system in Afghanistan. Ian, perhaps in the Q&A session, may say that it was because of our training, and we didn't give it enough training. We didn't give it enough focus to actually get the full benefits out of it, but perhaps we can investigate that during the Q&A. The Army then moved into the Scan Eagle, and unmitigated success. Tens of thousands of hours, as Ian mentioned, in successful surveillance in support of the Canadian Army operations in Afghanistan. It's pretty hard to argue with that. It was a lease, so power by the hour, as we call it. And so we had contractors doing the launching and recovery of the UAVs, or UASs, and the maintenance of them. And then we had the Army actually doing the operation of it during the combat patrols. We then brought the Heron into theater. And the Heron was really a response to the Manley Report on Afghanistan that assessed that the Canadian Army required a more persistent, a better ability to support their combat operations using a surveillance type of asset. We needed something that could stay in the air more than a couple of hours and could actually follow or go ahead of a convoy. Actually could go up to some of the combat areas that we were working in and conduct long-term, 24-hour long type of operations, to provide that pattern of life, to really get a sense of what was going on in the operations area. And what we had in theater could not do that. So the Heron was the solution. And again, the Heron as a leased capability was an outstanding success. 15,000 hours of surveillance conducted over 30 months, over 900 missions, all done with not a single accident and not a single major flight safety incident. Okay? From an Air Force guy's perspective, it doesn't get a whole lot better than that. All right, so that was a really assessed as an outstanding success from our perspective. As we start to move forward into the future a little bit, we take a look at the Army's future UAV, or family of UAVs, miniature and small UAVs that are all controlled by a common ground control system. As you see, the Scan Eagle has now entered, in the top right-hand side, has now entered the Navy operations, as Ian mentioned. And right now it's aboard HMCS Regina in supporting Operation Artemis in the Middle East. And you know, you've probably got a sense from Ian's commentary that the Navy doesn't want to deploy without this kind of surveillance asset. Well, neither does the Army. And to fill the gap that we currently have, we've got the Justice program underway right now. And it's the Joint UAS Targeting and Acquisition System. That's what Justice stands for. And where we sit right now is that is the Department of National Defense's long-term solution for an operational level of surveillance. We are currently in the options analysis phase, and we anticipate government approval for the program coming up next year. But we're working very, very closely, as you can imagine, with PWGSE, with the Treasury Board, and with Industry Canada to make sure we get the right UAS for the right system for Canadians. And that's where we sit on what we've done and where we're going. Now, how we're going to use them is as a system of systems. And this is in concert with what has been published in the Canadian Forces Defence Strategy. As a system of systems, there's no single aircraft that does everything exceptionally well. We understand that in the Air Force. In fact, you could almost have a radar a satellite in this picture as well to fully flesh out what a system of systems would be. But as we look at what we currently have with the Aurora aircraft, it is a manned aircraft. It's got good, solid capabilities in complex environments, like, for example, anti-submarine warfare, areas that UAVs or UASs can't really perform well. On the other side of the spectrum, we've got UASs that are excellent at long-term surveillance, wide area surveillance, okay? You know, days, 40 hours worth of long-term pattern of life assessment. And an example of how we may use this type of system of systems, if you will, in the domestic context would be off the coast of the Atlantic on the maritime approaches. The commander of Maritime Atlantic has a responsibility to monitor the shipping traffic going in and out of his area. So we could perhaps send up the Justice, a UAS, up into the area, and you can have upwards of 200 contacts, 200 ships in his area of responsibility. So for the routine, mundane assessment using a multiple sensor approach, you can identify, you know, 99% of those ships. But there may be those ships you can't identify, or there may be ships that are conducting a suspicious type of activity. Well, this is where your manned platform comes in to do that identification in a slightly more complex environment. Now, from the rules perspective, and yeah, you know, Errol had brought this up. We envision, okay, in accordance with the Canadian Forces Defence Strategy, that there's going to be a domestic role for our UASs, without a doubt. And first and foremost, it is surveillance of our maritime approaches and our Arctic. We have a responsibility, a sovereignty responsibility, to ensure that shipping in our areas of responsibility are monitored, and our Arctic is surveyed. We also see the use of UASs in support to OGDs, other government departments, the RCMP, Defense Department of Fisheries and Oceans, emergency management organizations, for things like search and rescue. You know, finding that needle in the haystack in the forest, for example, for disaster assistance. And the picture you see here is of, as you can imagine, is of southern Manitoba during the floods. Okay, it would have been fantastic to have a long endurance UAS up there to monitor where the areas that were hardest hit were, to monitor the water levels, and, you know, most importantly, to determine where there are people that need to be rescued. From the international context, of course, we look at deployed military operations and the support to deploy military operations, the Afghanistan context, the Libyan context. And part of the Justice program includes the requirement for a precision strike capability. But we also see the potential for UASs as a contribution to NATO and to UN efforts. Counter-piracy efforts, for example, going off the coast of Somalia. They are a huge concern. They're always lacking the surveillance type of capabilities. And, of course, humanitarian relief efforts. The post-tsunami, the post-hurricane type of surveillance. Where are the areas that are hardest hit? And just to give you an example of that view from the ground, these are some quotations of why we see in the Canadian Forces the requirement for UASs in our inventory. The first quotation you see there is from the commander of the Heron Detachment in Afghanistan, where he's talking about, you know, when he's talking about the Canadian Forces, okay, the Canadian Army does not want to move unless they have a Heron above them in support of their combat operations. The next two are quotations from Army commanders, my colleagues in the Canadian Army. And of course, the first, and their commanders as well. The first one being, UAVs are a force multiplier, meaning that they are more than just the single capability that they provide. Okay, they create a much larger effect. And they force the enemy to expend resources where they wouldn't normally do that. They force the Taliban to conduct concealment type of operations. And of course, the last quotation mark there is, you know, coming from one of my Army colleagues. I think that the hashed out word is probably heck. So why the heck can't you guys fly all the time? That is a statement right there. Talk a little bit about the challenges that we have in Canada for UASs. The first being the environment. And UASs have been significantly developed and deployed for conflict in hot, dry areas. Now, let's overlay the Canadian context onto that, where we have extreme icing conditions on either coast. We have extreme temperatures and wind up north, and now try to look for that type of technology that can actually operate effectively in our most difficult of environments. Airspace access was also brought up. You know, how do we now start to integrate manned aircraft with unmanned aircraft in the same airspace? How do we do that? You know, the sense and avoid type of technology that will facilitate that is not mature yet to be able to deploy it. So how do we do it in the meantime? And of course, if we're going to survey our north, we need to be able to send our UAVs up there. And we have this communication problem up north, and we have this satellite support problem up north, where satellite support does not go above 65 north. And if you're controlling your UAS from somewhere down south, and your UAS is somewhere up north, well, you now have a limitation of how far north you can go. We'll talk a little bit about policy here in my last couple of slides. Considerations as we start to develop, as we start to mature our policy going forward for the operation of UASs. And this is more of a philosophical diatribe than anything. We're looking to, rather than create a parallel stream of rules and regulations and policy for UAVs versus manned aircraft, we would rather have the UAS capabilities conform to what we currently have, less complicated. So for example, if manned aircraft require a certain lighting configuration, we'll have the same rule for unmanned aircraft. Airworthiness is another issue where we've made some significant progress in the fairly recent past with our NATO allies. And in fact, we've managed within NATO to come up with a common airworthiness standard for the certification of UASs. It's actually been adopted by some civil aviation authorities. One of the reasons that I don't like the word drone is because it has a connotation of something that's autonomous and something that goes forward and does things. From the Canadian Forces perspective, for UAS, there is always a person in control. Even with the Heron that was able to conduct a certain number of activities, such as landing and taking off, in an automatic type of system, there was always a pilot sitting in his ground control station that was able to control that aircraft at any time during the flight. All right, and so that's the philosophy. There will always be a person in control, always a decision maker there. The weaponization piece, and we look at from the Canadian Forces perspective, we look at UASs if they're weaponized just the same as we look at F-18s. All right, we have a common rule of engagement that we overlay for all F-18 operations. The anticipation is we do exactly the same thing for UAS operations. And privacy, it's already come up. You know, we all have this vision of drones looking at our swimming pool, looking inside of our windows, this kind of thing. Well, the reality is, and Errol brought it up, is that we do have a set of regulations. And oh, by the way, we have a whole bunch of surveillance-type aircraft, both civilian and military in Canada right now, that are conducting surveillance operations. And they're conducting them under a strict set of laws. And so if those laws aren't correct, then let's change the laws. Let's not try to overlay something just because we're going to be conducting UAS operations within Canada in the domestic context. And my last slide is the regulatory environment. We have an interesting regulatory environment within Canada. Unlike the Americans, which have the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, we have two. We have Transport Canada and we have the Department of National Defence. And so the implications of that are if the Minister of National Defence is comfortable and confident with the UASs that are being employed, the regulations are in place, the policies in place, the procedures are in place to conduct these operations, then he can give the go-ahead to do that. In fact, we're already flying, of course, UASs in military ranges right now. So the question is, or the point, I guess I would like to say, is that the reality is that we are all good stewards of the aviation environment. And so we're working very, very closely with Transport Canada, NAV Canada, in a number of different areas to work to mature our UAS policy. Transport Canada has hosted a couple of working groups that D&D's participated in. And so we're sharing our information. We've had a couple of information sharing opportunities. And these have all actually worked to help the Canadian Forces to start to mature our regulations, to the point that we've actually now incorporated UAS operations into our overarching flying regulations. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll probably leave this slide up because I think it's going to be question period here pretty shortly. The reality is we gained a lot of experience in Afghanistan. We have a huge amount of lessons that we've identified from our operations in Afghanistan and our operations in Libya as well. And we're now looking to take those lessons and apply those as we move forward with both the Army, with the Army, the Navy, and soon to be the Air Force on everything from tactical to operational level UAS operations, both in Canada and in the domestic context, or in the international context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General, for sharing your insights on the investments made by the Canadian Forces as well as the Canadian government in UAVs, as well as the policy and the thoughts behind the policy moving forward from now on.